I've been reading the latest book by David Bentley Hart, intriguingly entitled You Are Gods. It's him in an academic mode, a collection of papers mostly, which is not to say it's not full of energy and punch as usual, but it is in a more abstract vein for the most part, so isn't one of his easier reads. But in it is a revision, or better, really, a recovery of what in the introduction he also calls Christian Vedanta, Vedantic Christianity, or Christian non-dualism. And this is not new from David Bentley Hart, who in particular is well versed in the Advaita Vedanta tradition of India, but it is indirectly an unpacking of what all that means for Christianity. And so, borrowing liberally from the book, I've put together, if you like, this account of what that strand of Christianity looks like. The mystical strand, the strand that is much more dominant, I think, in the East because of the notion of deification, theosis, but is still present richly in Western Christianity in figures like Meister Eckhart, Catherine of Genoa, and other Beguines, Teresa of Avila. And one I think that increasingly speaks to people today in a plural age. So, in the next few minutes, maybe quite some time, I want to move across almost in a systematic way what this means by looking at who we are as human beings, God and Trinitarianism from this non-dual Vedantic point of view, Jesus in history and the Incarnation, what salvation is, what the Spirit is, creation and desire, the nature of worship in this mode, which I think particularly matters because it's so easy to feel that the non-dual understanding isn't present in modern day worship. The nature of grace and also suffering in this understanding, eschatology too, and what a Christian life looks like from this perspective. Bentley Hart also makes various comments against related trends in Western idealism, such as that God is emergent or that creation somehow completes the divine. And I think that's important. And then also things about judgment and freedom. So, to get to the heart of it, the Christian Vedantic gospel is to discover and then realize, no, not just in our minds, but as we live our lives, in the felt sense of attitude, awareness, stance in the world, that we are gods and the kingdom is within us. Human beings are at heart consciously awakening to the infinite, and were made by the infinite to know this. We are nothing, Bentley Hart writes, we are nothing but created gods coming to be, becoming God in God, able to become divine only because, in some sense, we are divine from the very first. Now, this is a very striking way of putting things to Western sensibilities, but the mystics have long said it. Just a well-known quote from Meister Eckhart: "The eye wherein I see God is the same eye wherein God sees me. My eye and God's eye, this is one eye and one seeing and one knowing and one loving." It's a quote that David Bentley Hart uses in his book. So it's a gospel, good news, that is both deeply appealing, easy to get wrong, but my increasing sense is one that genuinely is right for our times. The kingdom of God is within us, and we are gods. And the great invitation is to work out what that can possibly mean. Open onto, let go, let in, discover that which is within us. Now, just to say that Bentley Hart locates this in key scriptural passages. It's not just plucking this out of the mystic's air. The phrase "you are gods" comes from the 10th chapter of John's Gospel. Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your laws, I said, you are gods? If he called those to whom God's logos came gods, and if scripture cannot be dissolved, do you then tell him whom the Father sanctified and sent out into the cosmos, you blaspheme, just because I have said I am the Son of God?" So that's Jesus quoting the Hebrew scriptures, including the verse saying, "You are gods." Then also in Luke 17, there's the famous remark about the kingdom of God being within. The kingdom does not come as something one observes, nor will persons say, "Look, here it is," or "There it is." For look, the kingdom of God is inside you. It's another key text. Bentley Hart also talks about other passages, which we'll come to, but just to pick up on one now. Genesis 2:7, when God makes Abraham by breathing life into him. Bentley Hart notes that God's uncreated spirit is breathed directly into human beings, and so there is something of the divine within us. Again, as Eckhart puts it, his ground is my ground, and my ground is his ground. It's prioritizing that insight that Vedantic Christianity does. But it also follows, I think, quite naturally from monotheism. God is all that is. Whatever is not God exists as becoming divine, and as such is the mode of God, if you like, of what is other than God. But of course, at the same time, God is not the other of anything. This is picked up incidentally in other monotheisms, not least in Sufism. Ibn Arabi talks about journeying, and we can feel we're journeying from God as if we're not in God, and yet that's only to discover more of where God is. So God is all. That must include us. The question is how we come to know that and understand it. And then, of course, there's also the patristic sayings, which are very clear about this, that God became human so that humans should become God. Only the God is always already human can become human. Only a humanity that is always already divine can become God. And so the early Christian church worked this out. I think it got lost in the West, largely through the processes of the Reformation, and hence is still alive very much in the East. So if that's the good news, if that's the understanding, how can that be unpacked? And Bentley Hart begins in his book, we're teasing out the supposed opposition between nature and supernature and showing how this is false. So this has become widespread actually in secular culture, let alone in theological discourse, the idea that there's the natural world understood by the natural sciences, and that anything which doesn't fit into that account might be called supernatural, kind of above nature, and of course in the modern world therefore disregarded. But even in theology, the idea that there is nature, say, and then there's grace, and these are two different things, nature needing grace in some way to lift it out of itself to the divine, to save it. That's become quite a common way of talking about things in theology, which Bentley Hart deeply resists. He calls it the two-tier understanding of reality, that there's nature, this subscribed totality, and this supernature which is separate and even optional, and shows that that separation, that divide must be wrong. We know that nature leads seamlessly to the supernatural, even in our own experience. We know that finite things can't bring happiness, and that's because God, knowledge of God, is our natural goal. And so, as Blake puts it, we want the all, and if you sell more incremental, finite things to try and satisfy that desire, you lead to all sorts of disaster, personal unhappiness, the consumption of the world. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God, because the divine is in our hearts. Our minds are created for the specific purpose of seeing God, the infinite. also, Bentley Hart reflects upon the way that we know, and this is something he's becoming quite well known for in relation to understanding consciousness, that when we reflect upon the way that we know, our awareness, metacognition, it can't be that what we do is represent reality to ourselves as if we're disconnected from reality, but create ways of holding it in mind, which oddly seem to bring mind to an understanding of the world that works well, as if by some kind of lucky chance. Because, of course, what we know about the world massively exceeds what we need for pure evolutionary survival. So there's something of a massive coincidence going on here if the way that we represent reality to ourselves is so revelatory of the world, like discovering theories such as evolution. Bentley Hart is quite clear about this. It's superstitious to believe that the measurable material world, which is also pure quantity without any qualities at all, can give rise to the gloriousness of phenomenal experience, though, according to the understanding, it would have to be pure and originless illusion. That would be an extraordinary miracle, that out of pure quantity can come the richness of quality. It might give the materialist pause in itself. But what a participatory understanding of consciousness does is sidestep all that by saying that our mind and the world and the divine belong to one another from the first. They flow from and participate in the single source that is God. So what we're ignorant of is not a question of seeing through our representations, but is lifting the veil of ignorance about the way we see the world as such. We see it wrongly, which is to say that we see it apart from an awareness of its source. That's the main veil that needs to be lifted, so that the mind and the world can be seen to coincide, fit like a hand in a glove, because the mind and the world are one in the one from whence they came. And a biblical expression that captures this is that we will know even as we are known. And this sense of things in the Vedantic tradition, in Christian mysticism, is felt as peace, because we come to feel that we're at home, that all we are is realized within our minds. We're transparent to ourselves, known as we are known, and hence in the Advaita Trinity of Sat Chit Ananda, being, the way things are, consciousness, knowledge of the way things are, is Ananda, bliss, peace too. This follows from reflecting upon everyday experience about how we know and receive the world through participation, not through representation. So the Christian non-dual perspective realizes that actually it's the supernatural, the divine, if that's not too awkward a way of putting it, gives birth to the natural. It's from the divine, the natural world. The wonder of being, awakening to our existence, is that which powers our turning towards other beings. It's not pure instinct for spiritual creatures, at least. It's the desire to know, the desire to reach out, to understand, from which lots of useful byproducts such as survival come. That's the primary power of wonder alive in us. It's love that shapes our intellects, wanting to understand, wanting to relate to, and so the intellect creates the ways in which we can do that, understanding the world, deepening a perception of things beneath just appearances, which of course is what science does. And that too is a natural activity for we human beings. The springing of something from nothing, in a way, happens within our understanding as much as in creation itself. It's the dynamic of all reality. When we participate in reality, more and more shows up, but also is made. And so we become co-creators with the divine. And it's a deep truth that part of the human calling is to realize the divine in the natural world, because the divine is always already there. You might say that there's a surfeit of being in beings. The supernatural is throughout the natural world, which is why nature is so lovely to us and why it becomes engrossing to spiritual beings such as ourselves, because we're drawn by this surfeit. We don't just see the wildflower, we see heaven in a wildflower. We don't just see a colour, we see beauty in the colour. We don't just see the way the world's made, we see an intelligence, a truth in the way that the world is made. That's the surfeit of being, which of course all people experience. The greatest science writing is wonderful because the greatest scientist never loses touch with the wonder that first inspired them to their investigations. You might even say that the scientific life is not satisfying because of the science, but because of what the science radiates and the way it cultivates the mind of the scientist to become more and more transparent to the intelligence of the cosmos. Science is an activity of disclosing the working of beings, and it's in the nature of being to self-disclose. So science is a deeply religious activity, in fact, which of course some scientists know. But this is to say that our spiritual nature cannot have a finite, limited end. Our worldly experience of beauty and other values are intimations that the end we desire is divine life. We might live natural lives, but we have this supernatural vocation, as Bentley Hart puts it. That supernatural vocation is our only sufficient and satisfying end. And this is really crucial in the modern world, because we've made the finite an end, and of course it's not a satisfying end, and so drives the consumption of our lives and the world around us. And so this Vedantic non-dual understanding is really fundamental to re-understanding who we are, the lives we can live, that isn't destructive, that isn't trapped in a kind of flatland of pure naturalism. So that's where Bentley Hart starts dissing this two-tier understanding of reality, which is both powerful in the secular world but also very prevalent in the religious world. But how does Christianity articulate its non-dualism, as it were, from the most fundamental, basic, from the ground up? And it does so in its Trinitarianism, as is widely understood in the East, perhaps not so much in the West, but that's the non-dualism that Christianity can offer to the other non-dualisms. Sufi non-dualism derives and starts from the clarity with which it sees the oneness of the divine, and Advaita Vedanta perhaps starts from the way it understands human consciousness, hence its psychological appeal. Well, Christianity starts from its interest in the figure of Jesus, which of course leads to its Trinitarian perception of the divine. And a pivotal moment came when, in the patristic period, the early writers on this realized that creation is not a procession from God in an increasingly diminished manifestation of reality as that proceeded from the divine, but that the divine being is always located throughout reality. This is a bit of a shift from earlier Neoplatonic understandings. The divine must be present in all things because God is all in all. And so the Logos in creation is the Logos within God too. That intelligence which is felt about, that perception of the surfeit of being which we are drawn to and experience all day, every day, is the divine within all beings. And so creation is the revelation of God. It's a theophany. It's not merely a distant reflection of God's activity in a more deistic understanding. The transcendent is utterly immanent. And the Spirit then is the perfect reflection of God. And so participating in life as human beings fully is participating in the Spirit too, and participating in God. These Trinitarian reflections unfold in one another. And in particular, in Eastern Orthodoxy, this is realized that being created as a human being is therefore also being deified. Being human is being divine, as the Incarnation, of course, highlights, which we'll come to in a minute. God is God by being manifest to God's self in God, of which we are a part, known insofar as we perceive that being, consciousness and bliss are ours and are one and are divine. Bentley Hart talks about God as an eternal play of the visible and invisible in God's self, but also in creation, made visible in the Son, searched out by the Spirit. And so we are a temporal play of the divine, being made visible in lives, yearning and seeking more in our spirits, because we are also sharing in the eternal play of the divine. The immanent Trinity and the economic Trinity are one Trinity, not a diminishment one of the other. Christian non-dualism might be called a circle of glory. David Bentley Hart puts it using Augustine's phrase on the Trinity, that there's the continual moving out and returning within the divine movement, the divine dynamic of infinite play, glory, love, expansion. And our temporal lives are known too to be part of that circle of glory as well, in our searching out, in our making manifest, in our own temporal transformation, deification. Creation and deification are one in this understanding. So Jesus in history looks quite different from the Jesus that you might otherwise meet as presented in churches or different Christian accounts. This is not a gap theory of reality, as if what we know most immediately every day has become separate from divine life. No, what we know most immediately every day is divine life. And so the Incarnation is not a joining of the eternal and the temporal, as if they were uncoupled before, the human and the divine restored. No, it's a manifestation of what is already the case, that the temporal and the eternal are one, that the divine and the human are nested in each other. The Incarnation was always going to happen. It's not as if God looked down on the creation and thought, oh dear, something's gone wrong, I better do something about it. No, this was always going to follow. And so the Jesus of the Gospels, say, who's prophetic, announcing the kingdom, condemning the cruel, moving towards the cross as an expression of the longing of God for creation, is also the God who is the light of eternity in time, the judgment that reveals and so saves us by manifesting the divine destiny in all. This is why in John's Gospel, for example, the cross is the glorification of Jesus, and it is the celebration that God is in all things, even in death itself. The union of the human and the divine is the truth of the Incarnation, David Bentley Hart stresses. And it's because the human and divine are one, because the human is completely, naturally compatible with the divine. Again, this kind of ringing of the gospel bell. Do we understand? Have we the eyes to see, the ears to hear? If our nature wasn't already wholly contained in the divine, the Incarnation would be a reconciliation requiring a change in either human nature or in divine nature to bring in the human. And as Bentley Hart says, this would make Christ a divine-human chimera or a human-divine hybrid. But as he explores in one of his more analogical passages, you can no more change the human to make it divine or change the divine to incorporate the human, bring that union that's promised, than you can change a turnip into a rabbit without destroying the turnip. You'd have to reconstitute the turnip to turn it into a rabbit. And even more so, Bentley Hart continues, if you were to turn a rabbit into an angel, that is not what Christianity is about, any more than a circle can become a square without destroying the circle. There's a continuity in us, and so creation, incarnation, salvation, which I'll come to in a minute, deification, are a continuous act, a continuous unfolding of the human vocation, not discontinuous interruptions to try and save something that's gone terribly wrong. And interestingly, though, this also means that there'll be many accounts of history which are as many expressions of God's outpouring in time. The basic awareness of our creation out of nothing from eternity in the divine can lead to many explorations, expressions of that in time. So Christianity is not a truth in competition with non-Christian falsehoods, in inverted commas, Bentley Hart stresses, but it's just one trajectory in time within the divine life in eternity. And of course, Christianity itself contains many Christianities which are such trajectories as well, unfolding in myriad ways through time as an expression of the one way in the divine life of eternity. And Bentley Hart's really strong on this. One of his punchier passages is when he reflects that trajectories outside the Christian tradition can easily manifest what the Christian tradition is trying to say better. So, for example, he says the bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism, where the enlightened being returns to the world of suffering for the betterment of their fellows, that's closer to divine life than penal substitution in Reformed theology. Or classical Vedanta, which understands that being, consciousness and bliss are one and that all is contained in the divine life, is closer to the heart of Christianity than what Bentley Hart calls this two-tier understanding, a separation, a gap between the divine and us. So that's to say something about the Incarnation and Jesus and how that is another revolving around unfolding of what it means to say you are God's, the kingdom of God is within us, and that union is our natural, deepest state. So it clearly shifts the sense of salvation as well. We live in a divine reality, not alienated from its source, not a reality created apart from God, but in the midst of a theophany. And the challenge is to see this theophany, to overcome the impediments, to develop the eyes that can see and the ears that can hear, as Jesus, I think in his most common remarks, says throughout the Gospels. We have a natural tendency toward full union with God. And so what's called salvation, I do wonder whether another word might be needed here really, but it's the traditional word, works by removing the impediments to our natural union, not by bridging a gap or removing something as if it were in the way. It's not as if God first created and then saved, but rather this kenosis, this outflow, that's not a separation but a glorification, an extension, an enlargement of what's already infinite, is to awaken to the fact that this extension, this kenosis, is outpouring, and the Logos is our life, our Logos too. I think this is an interesting way of putting it that Bentley Hart doesn't quite do in his book, but it occurred to me as I was talking about it that Christ's life is not a kind of hero's tale in which all has been lost, and no, all is lost by the hero so that the treasure can be found. The Joseph Campbell hero's tale. It's one of freedom, peace, and gift giving, a going forth because all wealth and all poverty are already known to be part of the divine fullness of love. And so, for example, the significance of the Good Samaritan is that this individual was free to reach out to the need that was seen around. That is why it's a parable of the kingdom, not just an instruction on how to live well. And Christ is also free to turn to all. The cross reveals an infinity that surpasses, not heals, all separations. It lifts up, not bridges. And as Bentley Hart says it, the eye of charity, therefore, finds beauty even where we should not expect to find it. He remarks that this is perhaps the most distinctive contribution of Christian ascetics to the world, that with the cross at the centre and the recognition that even that is in some way beautiful, Christianity seeds the idea that the divine beauty can be seen everywhere, because that's what the life of Jesus shows us. And so-called salvation is more like realization, awakening to the beauty that is everywhere. And of course then that, with the recognition, transforms it, much as the cross became the resurrection. So salvation is therefore an expression of non-dualism in Christianity, again because creation and salvation are one, as much as incarnation and divinization are one. This move to unity across these different theological reflections is distinctive of the Vedantic understanding. It's also a kind of heuristic, a guide. Can we see how these seemingly different things are actually part of the singular action of God? Again, a reflection that nothing could be in existence that was not first in full union with God. We are gods in God when we understand ourselves as in God. So the Spirit too, of course, plays a key part in this. And an interesting way that Bentley Hart unpacks this in his book is he talks about how when Paul talks about the Spirit in his letters, it's often very hard to work out whether Paul's talking about the divine Spirit or the Spirit of God in us or our spirit. And Paul seems to be coming to the conclusion that that is just the one Spirit. There's a non-dualism that runs deeply through Paul's most penetrating remarks. So, for example, in Romans, the love of God in our hearts is the Spirit poured into us. When we know the love of God in our hearts, we know the Spirit as well. Our conscience is the Spirit alive in us. Paul also says in Romans, he says, those who live according to the Spirit set their hearts on the things of the Spirit because the Spirit dwells in them. And then, of course, in Romans 8, the famous remarks about the Spirit groaning within us when we don't know what to say. What we thought were our prayers were always along the Spirit praying within us. We don't live or die to ourselves, we live or die to God. Continuing in 1 Corinthians, particularly various passages there where Paul talks about how speech and words are a demonstration of the Spirit. Can you feel the Spirit in what's being said? this surfeit of being that appears even in our words, the Spirit of God which searches God out and reveals God to us, God revealing God's self to us, which is a reflection of the life of the Trinity. We're temples of God and the Spirit. Paul continues in 1 Corinthians, those who are joined to the Lord are one spirit with God. We can't sing, pray or bless unless we have the Spirit that brings an understanding to our singing, our praying, our blessing. Continues in other letters, just a couple from Galatians which are well known. We are born according to the Spirit and we wait in the Spirit. All is happening within the divine life. We know the fruits of the Spirit, of course: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These are all manifestations of the divine life, immanently known to us as much as transcendently present. We are spirit becoming spirit, you might say. God's breath is our breath. Bentley Hart uses the figure of the cross, a kind of chiastic form, to express this as well. Since God does not come into existence, that's like a chiastic reflection of how we're created from nothingness. We're drawn towards the infinite by the divine freedom, whereas the divine freedom is always already part of the infinite life. So whilst God's Spirit is the fullness of God's life, our life is only fulfilled in the return to the Spirit of God, which is another way of saying that our desire is always for the infinite, that natural ends can't satisfy us, only the divine end does. This then leads to reflections on creation, as I'm putting it together. And we're inclined, I think, we're taught to stress the fact that we're contingent, finite, separate. And this loses touch with the eternally present within us, because creation is the eternal act of God. This is particularly clear in Eastern Orthodox figures like Gregory of Nyssa. The primary act of creation is the divine act of the Son and the Spirit within the Trinity, and that what we experience as creation in time is a working out and a return of that divine act. The consummation of creation in time is the origin of creation in eternity. As Bentley Hart puts it, nothing can exist that is not always already in eternity, divinized, plunged ecstatically into the fire of the divine life. Or he adds, our being in God and God's being in us are both also and more originally God's being as God. Our being in God and God's being in us are also both more originally God's being in God. When we know ourselves to exist, we can know ourselves to be the divine life as well. That's an extra gloss on this expression, you are gods and the kingdom of God is within. Creation is in eternity, but expressed in time, and incarnation and deification are one with creation. Creation is God expressed in the mode of God, outpouring and returning to God. Every moment of our lives can be known as an outpouring and returning of divine life. This is the gospel, the good news of Vedantic Christianity. So, to correct other understandings of creation, creation is neither a free act of God's sovereignty, as if God was hanging around in eternity, wondering what to do and said, oh, I know, I'll make more. It's only perfect freedom that can offer us an unhindered realization of our proper end. Bentley Hart puts it. This is the meaning of creation out of nothing. There's no demand. Our will, which appears to be able to choose, to put it another way, is not a product of our freedom, but of our finitude. But the divine will, which is in infinitude, doesn't choose. It is actus purus, as Thomas Aquinas puts it. There's nothing remaining potential in the God. All is actualized. That's the divine freedom. And so that is what we can understand as our destiny, our understanding being drawn towards when our will and the divine will become one will. This is what it is to know the source of every being in your being. Just to say a little bit more about desire then and human longing and the way in which it's divine, because one of the things which I wanted to do in my reading of Bentley Hart is to try and capture how we might know this, not just how we might express it in more rational ways. We've already said that all desire is really desire for God, which is why any attempt to satisfy desire other than God fails sooner or later. So when we desire, we already know, even if vaguely, that what we desire is the divine. For all that the vagueness can be very persistent, and an entire culture can be built upon confusion about the ends of our desire. But what non-dualism would say is that we can see that all knowledge is to exceed what is most immediately being studied, which again is why scientists detect laws, for example, when they observe the world and don't just write descriptions of what they're observing. Powerful passage, Bentley Hart puts it like this. He says, one cannot contemplate a flower, watch a play, or pluck a strawberry from the punnet without being situated within an irrefrangible intentional continuum that extends all the way to God in God's fullness. So every act of contemplation, looking, whether it be a flower, a play, even plucking a strawberry from a punnet, is to be part of that desire which is step by step, if we were to follow it, unfailingly leading us back to an awareness of the divine. He says in another place, the mind longs from the first not only to reach, but to become that divine truth that gives being to all things, which of course is why the mind can be a dangerous thing as well as a luminous thing. If every act of desire, moment of contemplation stirring within us is in truth the yearning to become divine, when that's not recognized, it can become powerfully dangerous rather than wonderfully luminous. Another reason why this understanding is really important. Rational life is a finite participation in an infinite act of thought that is also the whole of being. Bentley Hart puts it as well, which is also to say, why the physicist reports the feeling of sharing in a wider intelligence, why the mathematician feels they're discovering a mathematical world. Every finite participation in an infinite is sharing in an infinite act of thought, and so the whole of being. The intellect, our intellect is not a passive mirror of reality, but is an active engagement on our behalf, connecting us back to the source of all reality, which is why when we reach one horizon we want to look for the next, why the world is not bounded and science and the arts will go on and on. We need to connect to that so that every small act in that continual unfolding can vertically be satisfying rather than lead with the dissatisfaction that wants the next. It's why wonder, to put it another way, is the beginning and end of philosophy. And reason is fundamentally ecstatic, not just logical. It loves the good, and so cultivating that sense of love in the investigation of the world, rather than just trying to put together an objective, consistent formularization of the world, which actually distances us from that which drew us to the investigation to start with, is so crucial. Every complexity invites a perception of simplicity. You might even say that natural light is so lovely because it's the light of glory. Again, This isn't highfalutin, although it can be. It's the deepest truth of every single act. It's a kind of worship, if you like. And Bentley Hart in his book has a few reflections on worship along the way. The experience of beauty, for example, doesn't just draw us, but it leads to a sense of reverence. And similarly, a kind of agitation in the soul that stirs the longing for the all can be felt as well. And converting that agitation into an expression of wonder, of praise, of thanks, is a crucial part of worship. Every moment in now lifts us from the mundane, be it a flower, be it moonlight, beam, be it hearing a songbird. When we feel that lift within us, it can become a moment of worship. And so that is a crucial part of human life. It's also an experience of judgment. I'll say a bit more about this later, but it's not the judgment that condemns, but that invites us to see, to share, to know. Can you see really what's being shown before you in life? So true worship sort of convicts us and ennobles us at the same time. It works at an aesthetic, really, not moral level. So if worship leaves you feeling inadequate or guilty, it's not inviting you into the divine life that is immanent. And similarly, the reason why Francis could kiss the leper or Teresa could follow the little way is because they saw the divine presence, not because they were sort of morally good. And this is then grace. This is the proper way of understanding grace, not as something separate from nature, as if grace were added nature. It is also the case that there's not really either a work of grace or a work of nature, or a salvation by works as opposed to salvation by grace. One follows from the other as the awakening, the enlightenment, the realization of the natural true nature of all things becomes clear to us. Nature is the manifestation of grace freely given. Grace is the form of nature. It makes nature actual. Bentley Hart says grace sets nature free from constraints. It perfects, not abolishes nature, which is the phrase used by Thomas Aquinas. If that is the graceful side, what about the suffering side? Touched on it a little. Not so much is said about it in this book by David Bentley Hart, but the core idea is that the experience of suffering is completely transformed with the understanding that the kingdom of God is within us, that you are God's. I mean, John of the Cross, who Bentley Hart doesn't reference in this book, but expressed it so clearly with his notion of the dark night of the soul, which is that when all that we had trusted, all that we had hoped for, all that we tried to control falls away and produces sometimes terrible suffering, within that darkness can be found a radiant darkness that is actually the ground of being, is the divine presence, is the spirit within us, which was there all along but got occluded by that which we took as substitutes for our life. And so suffering, as John of the Cross might say, can become sweet suffering when it reveals the truth of our nature. And once that becomes established, then suffering becomes transformed. If you like, particularly for spiritual creatures such as ourselves, suffering is greatly amplified by ignorance, as if we're just finite, as if there's a fear of non-being that produces violence, as if the darkness is perceived as a separation rather than as a clarification of our union. That the going out is actually the leading back to divine life, much as kenosis is an extension of the spirited life, not an emptying out into nothingness. Experiences of hell even can prompt us to long for more than we can imagine. in a negative mode that then can become the realization. We know this when we try to gather up the fragments of suffering experiences. Everything needs to be seen as vital because everything is part of one. It's why sufferers will say that they knew God in the midst of their experience, or at least called out to God. It's the truth that the not God seemingly is part of God. Still, such is the divine infinity. Now, in a suffering world, this can be hard to develop, become established in, of course. In a world of violence and greed, there's systemic concerns here, not just the personal as well, how we end up doing what we wouldn't do, not just because of our own contradictions, but because of the world in which we live. And so it can be hard to hear the divine voice or see the divine beauty in this way. And Bentley Hart makes an interesting suggestion here. He says that the best way to know of divine life in a greedy and violent world is to make our words and actions vehicles for truth. We can at least be responsible for them. And if we do that, even in a small, slight moment, speak a word of truth, do a thing of beauty, then we will see the divine immediately around us as well, in what we've done, in what we've said. Telling the truth, therefore, is so important because it is to side with the divine in our hearts, the divine will in our intentions, not simplistically, but wisely. Bentley Hart reflects on the Platonic Trinity of the good, the beautiful, and the true, and notes that these three, of course, work in a dynamic together. So we might not speak the truth in any particular moment because the good calls forth our holding back, our pause. We might even tell a lie, such as is the case of a novel, because the novel is an invocation of what's beautiful, even though in one literal sense it doesn't speak any truth at all. So what is really true is being itself, you might say. What's really good is being itself. What's really beautiful is being itself. And so the good, the beautiful, and the true continually give way to the revelation of being itself. This more, this surfeit that comes through. And so the good, the beautiful, and the true might even die for the life itself to be shown. It's guided by love, would be another way of putting it. What is most desirable. So forging a life that moves towards the more and more, guided by love, letting go of that which is finite, so that the infinite transfigures that life. That's going to be a revelation of the good, the beautiful, and the true, and the divine, even in a world that doesn't know of its divine origin. It's incidentally why in moral systems, say utilitarianism fails, or moral pronouncements actually end up disenchanting people. They are premised on a scarcity model of reality, as if we must make a calculation to create the greatest good that's possible, or we must combat that which is otherwise dragging us down into a pit that awaits us. No. Move towards the transcendent horizons that always draw us when we speak of these things, and reality will show up as abundant, that even the darkness will reveal itself to contain light. History exists, you might say, so that created spirits can be free, even in the process of their own creation. I think this is one of the ways in which transhumanism is so profoundly misunderstood today. You know, the version that comes out of Silicon Valley understands transcendence as emerging from a kind of accumulation of information, or a kind of direction of travel for the unfolding of consciousness. Whereas what this understanding, the Advaita non-dual Christian understanding, is saying, no, it's rather by embracing the mystery looking towards the ineffable, the transcendent horizon, that we ourselves are transformed. Because what makes for our transhumanism is not just knowledge about beings, but is knowing being itself. And then we can share in the being of all beings, which are always manifestations of being along. This is nudging us towards perhaps an eschatological understanding of things. And eschatology is crucial for Bentley Hart's vision. It's how we can know that the realization in eternity can be felt in time. We're in time, but we talk of what's in eternity. Eschatology is our final cause. It's why we exist in a more technical mode, as Bentley Hart puts it. But it's this union in the divine of the created and the uncreated. It's humanity understood as participating in divinity. It's our transparency to the divine. When we feel that moving through us, we feel the final indistinction that is our eschatological destiny. Similarly, in this eschatological frame, it knows that the incarnation is not a result of sin, but of creation. God so loved the world that God was in the world. Not God so loved the world because the world had fallen apart from God. It's the insatiable intentionality of our being towards the divine being, this desire that longs for the infinite. It's remembering that the spiritual life is, in a way, a constant labour to remember who we are by knowing our end, that's also our beginning. Holding that in front of us, remembering who we are, is another way of putting this good news that you are God's, that the kingdom of God is within us, that the divine breath, the uncreated divine breath, was breathed into us. And it's the anticipation, of course, of our ascent to being in complete freedom when all is known even as we are known. It's the eternal yes of God to creation, but also our eternal yes of creation to back to God. That's the chiastic expression of eschatological hope. God said yes to creation, but the more we can say yes to all of creation, everything that happens in our lives, the more we're participating in that final vision. So, the Christian life starts to look very different, as I've hoped you've been feeling along the way. It's not one of dwelling in a sort of desperate hope or fear for the future, praying for a miracle, hoping for salvation, yearning for grace. Rather, it's the path towards realizing that there's no difference between grace and nature, between the infinite and the finite, between the human and the divine. Finite existence itself is always already nothing but the gracious effect of God calling creatures to himself out of nothingness. Bentley Hart puts it, we can only become what we are, and we are what we're becoming already. We can only desire what is potentially present within us, and that's the infinite, the divine that's already within us. We can trust our desires for all they need discerning and developing and manifesting. There's a single transcendent act and a single immanent mystery that is the life we're leading. There's no rivalry to be teased out between the transcendent and the immanent, the finite and the infinite. To put it another way, the infinite is not the name for that which goes on and on and on and on. It's that which is already within us, within the abyss of our being, as Meister Eckhart puts it. Nicholas of Cusa is another important figure in Bentley Hart's book. He has a whole paper on Nicholas of Cusa, and reflects particularly on Cusa's expression that were God not infinite, God could not be the end for desire. God shines in all human longing would be a Vedantic way of putting it. And that shining is our longing leading to God. Longing is from and to God. We enjoy the finite only when we enjoy the infinite in the finite. The Sufi way of putting it would be that God's face is everywhere, manifesting in all things. If often seeming veiled or symbolic, nonetheless, the more we see the divine face in all things, the more we know the truth of ourselves. And we look out to the world, but see through, not with the eyes, is Blake's expression. Sense data about the world comes to us, but the divine shines in that sense data, and aligning with that shining is the invitation. Bentley Hart has a nice analogue about this at one point. He says that it's a bit like when you don't see a friend who passes, even though your eyes were open, because your intention was elsewhere, maybe locked in a narrower vision. And so this opening of the Christian life is like being open to that which is passing and seeing it's the friend already, seeing it's the divine present already. It's the open intention rather than the one that's closed off. Again, this idea of attention is key, tracking back to the source. We don't just do it out of impulse. For spiritual creatures, there's always a weaving in of the desire for the good, the beautiful, and the true, not just pure instinct. And so Nicholas Accuser writes, the seeing eye direct at God is not a visible seeing, but is rather a seeing of the invisible within the visible. It's why we might want to live with a painting or stay in a place or be with a person. At one level, the painting, the place, the person are finite, but they are portals for the infinite. And so we want to live with them because we continue to take and receive and abide in the infinite within them. They have a mystery that would never exhaust us. They continue to give. Our finite imaginations and intuitions can continually feast on the infinity that's present. And so it's a desire that becomes satisfying. There's always more that's freely given. And so it becomes a resting place when we're with this painting we love, when we're in the place that feeds us, when we're alongside the person who is part of us. The divine is being communicated. And we really know this when our attention shifts from what something is to that it is. This is the wonder. This is being's gratuity. Sometimes it happens in peak experiences, but the invitation is to know it always, all the time, because we're always in being, we're always in the divine. And that collapse of subject and object, of the infinite and the finite, of the other, is the participation in divine life that makes us ever more perfect mirrors of the divinity. It makes people luminous or radiant when we see them. They are very definitely particular people, but because of that particularity, they're also the more. They're incarnations of the divine, as we all are, but that incarnation is now the guiding principle of the unfolding of their lives. It's to know fully even as we are fully known, knowing and being, becoming transparent in the love that the radiant or luminous person shines with. It's why the small moment can be quite as powerful as the dramatic moments. The widow's mite moves us to a perception of the kingdom rather than the flowery prayers of the clearly religious. It's why Mother Julian could see all in the ball that was just the size of a nut. Sometimes those minute particulars connect us more deeply to the divine because they don't confuse us with their brilliance, and instead the inner brilliance shines through. William Law, the Anglican divine, knew something of this as well. I liked that David Bentley Hart quotes William Law because he's also quoted by Owen Barfield, a figure who's deeply important to me. And William Law said this, he put it like this: "Thy natural senses cannot possess God or unite thee to him. Nay, thine inward faculties of understanding, will, and memory can only reach after God, but cannot be the place of his habitation in thee. But there is a root or depth in thee, from whence all these faculties come forth, as lines from a centre, or as branches from the body of the tree. This depth is called the centre, the fund or bottom of the soul. This depth is the unity, the eternity, I had almost said the infinity of thy soul, for it is so infinite that nothing can satisfy it or give it any rest but the infinity of God," when of course then all other things speak of that infinity. This is a modern understanding as well as an ancient understanding, one available in all traditions, even in the Anglican tradition of William Law. Now, it's important too to say something about creator-creature relations, because clearly this understanding is at risk of ego inflation, let alone the abuses we've already touched on. Because divine union is natural, this doesn't mean we don't need God's aid to fulfill it. You might say that it's natural for human beings to be friends, but we need friends, that which is more than our finite selves, to fulfill that potential. And then the friend, we say, is a blessing. It's not in our power alone to become a friend, and similarly it's not in our finite power alone to know of this divine potential. Divinity is an inherent possibility of humanity that needs divinity to actualized. Creatures participate in divine life, that word participating being crucial there, but it's the creator that imparts that divine life. When we imaginatively engage with the world, we need to understand that we're sharing in the divine imagination, as Coleridge put it. We are gods, yes, Bentley Hart stresses, but God's being deified in an ascent to God. The difference between creatures and creator, though, is qualitative, not quantitative, as the two-tier version of reality would have it. Christ is the human in full qualitative splendour, which is to say, in divine splendour, and so is the promise for us all. So similarly, ignorance of this morphs from looking like a kind of limitation on knowledge to an invitation to embrace the fullness of knowledge. It signals the presence of a limitless treasure in time. But there is that sense of fullness, of the treasure, of the ascent, of the splendour that we can feel being drawn towards even as we discover it within ourselves. Bentley Hart puts it well when he says, "We can't make ourselves gods, but we can desire to become a god to the precise degree to which we can grasp what a god is. Our knowing is our becoming. Our desire is our letting go to let in the more." This is the dynamic that human consciousness reaching towards the divine can make a way of life. Now, this is also to say that human consciousness doesn't add anything to divine consciousness. It's not that the divine is emerging across the course of history, as is sometimes said these days, picking up from German idealism, particularly the Hegelian story that God needed to create to know God's self, or that God had to limit God's self in the making of creation. The monotheistic point would be you could say the divine can't be dependent on less than the divine or other than the divine. That's a dogmatic way of putting it. But there's something more subtle to understand here, is that our lives don't add anything to God's life, because our lives are an expression of God's life. God becoming human, humanity, is not becoming God, is not God becoming God, Bentley Hart puts it, but rather the creature's divinization in the creaturely expression of the divine fullness is part of the infinite power of the divine life expressing itself. creation is fundamentally in eternity, worked out as we know it in time. So again, this is to say that nature's not a kind of completion of divine identity, because whatever possesses a divine or supernatural destiny is divine already. There can be no separation between nature and the divine any more than the turnip could become the rabbit without destroying the turnip. God does not destroy nature to redeem us. God completes nature in that which is already complete. That's what it is to be in union with God. And the reason why the finite can reflect the infinite is because the infinite is already within the finite. Much as William Blake could look at the sun and not just see the guinea gold shape, but the Holy of Holies crying with the angel's song. There is a deep truth even in the saying that a person can light up a room. That is the presence of the divine in all things, brought into that room in that moment, not making up something that's lost or lacking in the divine in that moment. So Bentley Hart's also keen to stress that an emergent doctrine of God, as if God is coming to be, as if God needed to withhold from creation in order to create, is not just a theological point, but leads to real suffering in the world. If we don't remember that our immanent lives are an expression of the divine life, then it's hard to see a way out of suffering, which spiritual traditions promise by the transformation of our understanding of ourselves. And more particularly, the great risk is it sets up a kind of series of binaries that without an orientation towards the divine source, wellspring and all, can become uncoupled and so flip. And so, for example, you can get the sense in these emergent understandings of divine manifestation that somehow we're saving ourselves rather than being saved, that somehow the divine horizon is the human horizon rather than the human horizon reaching towards the divine. That more and more the accumulation of information in the silicon transhumanist vision is the same as the realization of the all, when it's not. That progress gets confused with return. That mystery, which is the infinite fullness that we can be present to, know of, gets converted into a kind of excitement about the potentials of the moment, or conversely, a desperation about the suffering of the present, as if everything is at stake. Everything must be thrown into this present moment in a kind of revolution to stir up the possibility of tomorrow. That is politics as trying to bring about heaven on earth, and earth can't contain it, but earth can become a radiant presence of heaven. So similarly, Godhead, or the ineffable transcendence, the emptiness of the Indian traditions, it's vital to hold on to that perception of the abyss within us, which is the abyss, the mystery at the heart of all things, and not confuse that with the kind of pleroma or numinosity, the richness of being itself, without the emptiness that's the all, without the ineffable that is satisfying. The spiritual path becomes a bit interminable. It's a continual attempt to sort of mature, to progress, to integrate, rather than this moment of realizing that the letting go is to let into the divine, and then the source will fill us up from within, springing into new life which was already there. It's why in Advaitist circles this is sometimes called the effortless path, and why Jesus said, "My burden is light." That is as much a test of following this true path, alongside the increase in freedom, the sense of peace, the knowing that becomes transparent to being. We need to know that now, even in the darkness, is not separate from the light. And when you think about it, if it was just pure emergence, then that couldn't really lead anywhere. It would be a kind of inchoate striving of nature or the will. Bentley Hart remarks that couldn't produce God unless within that striving God already was, and so was withdrawing the emergence back to the divine source. The will needs an end if it's not to turn forever in confused circles. This is another mistake of the dream of a singularity, that computers will become a deity. But that deity would only be a monstrous amplification of what had been programmed into the computer in the finite world, whereas the dream of non-duality, the singularity in the divine, is drawn by the divine goodness in the divine singularity. Really, again, every time we think, desire, will something, this is active in us. This is the realization to keep returning to. So look, a couple of sort of final reflections and then bringing this all together. Just to say something a little bit more about this notion of divine judgment, that we are called to know more, and this invitation can be challenging. It's a very nice passage in which David Bentley Hart explains this, where he compares the famous section in Matthew 25 where Jesus says, "And when you do it to the least of my brethren, you do it to me." That's often interpreted in a kind of moral way, as if this is the need to tend to the poor because otherwise we'll be condemned. And a different understanding is drawn out when Bentley Hart compares that passage in Matthew's Gospel to Rilke's famous poem about contemplating the torso of the Greek statue of Apollo, which dwells on the lines, the movement, the dynamic that's held in the torso, but that ends with this arresting line, "You must change your life." And this is what judgment is in the non-dual understanding. It's the awareness that when we look at the least as well as the most beautiful, we're sharing in the divine life. It can be seen as much in the hungry and thirsty, towards whom we then act in a certain way, as the kind of chest and torso of the beautiful Apollo. Because both are asking, can we see the divine? You must change your life in order that that becomes manifest, if you can. It's a judgment that judges us because we're asked, what are we really seeing here? What are we really being drawn towards here? Can we see the unity within us all? Can we see the divine face present in all these things? It's the Christian expression that to see Jesus is to see the Father. And Bentley Hart puts it in a very nice way when he says, Christ passes through history as a light that reveals all things for what they are, and it is our ability or inability to recognize that light that shows us ourselves. And so it's a judgment that leads to freedom. Freedom known differently, not as my choice, my will, my desire, but freedom that's known as realizing the fullest within us, and so letting go of the separate self to enter into that which is the fullest. Bentley Hart says that in God there's no difference between freedom and necessity. And God's freedom is not as a kind of abstract sovereign will that could arbitrarily do anything at all. And in a way, neither is our freedom a finite equivalent of that. Rather, freedom comes when we do what we feel most drawn to, drawn by what is manifest as the good, the beautiful, and the true in our lives. It's the freedom to follow our desire to the infinite. So hence the artist is most free when they're compelled to produce. You might even say the baby's most free when nestling in the arms of the parent. Then they know what's good, beautiful, and true. And the necessity to be there, to do that, is their freedom. God's freedom is the actualization of all So there's nothing more to do but to enjoy, explore, and reflect. God doesn't, as it were, swim in a sea of possibilities, making choices about what to do, such as whether it's to create or not. No, God enjoys the freedom that has always already actualized everything, including the creation. So freedom is the ability to work out what we fully desire to know, as opposed to be caught in false ends or addictions. And again, the non-dual Vedantic understanding is crucial here, because we can only become free, therefore, when we fully desire to know ourselves as we truly are. So look, let me draw things to a close. We've moved across a range of parts of Christian, what's sometimes called systematic theology, drawing on David Bentley Hart's book, You Are Gods. He offers us a collection of academic papers that I've retold in this way, reflecting on who we are as natural beings. To be natural as a human being is already to be supernatural. There's no gap. Reflected about God and Trinitarianism, how the inner life of God going out and remaining in the ground is a reflection of our own life, is reflected in our own life. Known particularly in the Jesus of history, in the Incarnation, which is the natural union of the divine and the human, not a rescue. So salvation, therefore, is much more about removing the impediments rather than being in need of something. And we see this particularly in our inner lives, the kingdom of God that's within, that is the Spirit within us, which Paul intuited and increasingly developed when he could be speaking about the Spirit of God as our spirit in one and the same moment. And this unity is also seen when we understand that creation, incarnation, salvation is deification, that our desire is infinite, is for the surfeit of being. And so worship becomes an expression of that joy, that love, as well as having the judgment that's a kind of calling to enter into more. How must we change our lives to know the beauty of the divine in all things? Grace and suffering can become part of the same experience of knowing that union, either in the light or in the darkness. And so the Christian way of life is one of discovery, but which is really recovery of that which was already the case, that will be known fully in the eschaton, but can be known moment by moment in the now, which has this vertical connection to the divine as much as a temporal unfolding of things. Bentley Hart offers some warnings against various trends that seem related to this, that God is emergent or that creation completes the divine. No, that leads to personal suffering and even disastrous ends in the social setting as well. We already have the freedom we need because we're becoming all that we are, and knowing, realizing what that means is the invitation of the Christian Vedantic gospel. As Bentley Hart started, Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your laws, I said, you are gods?" And then in Luke's gospel, the kingdom does not come as something one observes, nor will person say, look, here it is, or there it is. For look, the kingdom of God is inside you. The summary position is that we are gods, and the kingdom of God is within us. The uncreated breath made us. Can we consciously know it in order to live it? The mystics have long said so, hence Meister Eckhart's expression, the eye wherein I see God is the same eye wherein God sees me. My eye and God's eye, this is one eye and one seeing and one knowing and one loving. And to give the last words to David Bentley Hart, who in his own distinctive, of course, particular way that shines with the surfeit of being, therefore, we are nothing but created gods coming to be, becoming God in God, able to become divine only because, in some sense, we are divine from the very first.